Hello, my GOPO children. Welcome back. Today we're talking about Chapter 15. Chapter 15 not only covers interest groups, but it also covers social movements, which is a little bit different from an interest group. So I'm going to show you the difference between the two. Okay. So the difference between an interest group and a social movement is that an interest group is an organization of people who come together with the goal of getting policies in their favor. A social movement kind of diffuses groups that educate the public and put pressure on policymakers in an effort to bring about societal change. So the big difference is interest groups are definitely more narrowed and they're definitely more formal with their group, and then social movements are kind of on a broader, more informal scale. We've seen interest groups talked about in American democracy or our representative government, our republic, forever. James Madison mentioned it, is that basically these groups are factions and they're inevitable in a representative democracy because we have the freedom or the liberty to choose to be a part of it. There can be dangers, though, in it because they can compete and try to dominate each other and it causes division. But if we want freedom, if we want liberty, they are inevitable. They're going to happen. So the three main group theories about interest groups goes back to Chapter 1, where we talk about the how they can affect the policy agenda. The first one is the theory of participatory government. This is the idea of a civil society. A civil society is a group outside of the national government that advocates for policy. It's group. It's just it's an informal group like we see. For instance, when first started with protest against brutality against African Americans by police. That's participatory democracy. That's civil society. Probably the greatest example of civil society would be like Martin Luther King's civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. The pluralist theory goes more along the lines of interest groups, where these groups are competing to get the government's attention to get on the policy agenda, and not one is more powerful than the other. And then the third theory is the elite theory, where basically a small group runs the country. It's kind of like when Donald Trump talked about draining the swamp. It's the people that Bernie and Donald Trump both are very much against, that they feel rule the entire country. So what do we tend to participate in? When it comes to volunteering for anything, the number one way we see Americans volunteering is with their religious groups and then education. After that, it kind of is a mix of different groups. So how can they make different changes? Well, they have challenges facing them. And interest groups, I'll use a lot of examples, but let's just use the NRA as an example, since they are technically the most powerful interest group in the country. They have to deal with collective action, which is political action that occurs when individuals contribute time, energy, and money to this larger group goal. It's really hard to do that sometimes, to get people super excited about something, giving money, giving time in order to do it. The NRA has been definitely the most successful in pushing for collective action. They also are dealing with the problem where they do something for the collective good, where these interest groups are trying to make a public benefit that all people can benefit from, but they might not get involved. And that's when you see the free rider problem. So I'll give you an example. The National Organization of Women, that is a group that represents half the country. I am not a card-carrying member, but I definitely have benefited from the collective good that they've done for women. But so that makes me a free rider. A lot of us are like that in many different ways. And in order to get rid of the free rider problem, a lot of these interest groups tend to do selective benefits. So they want you to be a card-carrying, paying member who's involved in stuff. And the way that they do that is by giving you certain benefits. If you join this, you get discounts on hotels and airfare and stuff like that. Let's skip that for now. All right, let's look at the tactics of interest groups. That's what they are. Now, what do they do to get done their goals obtained? Well, there's different types of groups. We see economic, we see public, we see single issue and government issues. Interest groups, probably the ones that are the most successful are the economic ones, because the members tend to be more engaged in being involved, because it's pretty much based on their jobs. Like, for instance, me being in the National Education Association, that's based on my job, or the American Medical Association is for doctors. Those tend to be more powerful because it's their livelihood. It's people's livelihood that they're affected by. So they want to advocate for the best they can get for their jobs. So one way that interest groups work is by lobbying. Lobbying is where they actually meet with public officials and actually try to work on policy goals. They'll do this in all branches. They'll sit down with legislatures and try to tell them, hey, pass this bill. They'll sit down with the executive branch and tell them, hey, I know this bill passed, that's in favor of us. Please help us get it implemented. Or the judicial branch, especially civil rights groups will go to the judicial branch and say, hey, this law isn't fair. Like with Brown versus Board, that's an example of the NAACP, an interest group for civil rights, went to them and said, this, separate but equal is not constitutional, fix it. That's lobbying. Lobbyists definitely provide useful knowledge and access to the government, but there's also this thing known as the revolving door, where it's this movement where ex-government officials, whether they're top dogs in the bureaucracy or elected officials at the national level, when they either don't get hired back or they quit or whatever, they tend to work for these lobbying firms making like bank 6-7 figures a year. And that way that they use those connections they made in the government to try to help out those interest groups. So if you ever want to make money, become a politician, quit, then work for an interest group and you'll make tons of money. This is an example of the revolving door, where it's like they did a survey of how many people work for your interest group that used to be a member of the national government. And you can see a lot of these do that, like the pharmaceuticals interest group. They have 56 people from the national government that work for them now. It's just having your foot in the door. That's kind of a way to help with lobbying. How else can they get involved? By influencing legislation. Here's what the lobbyists do when they're talking to Congress. They'll contact members of the staff, prepare research reports and briefs that bring more attention to an issue. They might even help the people working for the office actually draft or write a bill because they're experts in that area. But when they're establishing these rules and procedures at the bureaucratic level, a lot of these interest groups will work with them in order to help them implement it in a way that they know would be best for their policy goals. They also could aid in regulating these goals. So like, let's say there's the Sierra Club, that's an environmental group. They might help the EPA with making sure that all of the laws to help clean up the environment are being implemented right, and that their regulations are sound. How do they influence the judiciary? I just explained that with Brown versus Board. The NAACP can say, hey, can you please look into this? It's unconstitutional. Now, in that case, as you notice, the plaintiff is Brown, the defendant is Board of Education. You do not see the NAACP anywhere in there. But what they can do is help out in the case by submitting an amicus curiae brief, where it's amicus curiae means friend of the court, where they're giving information, in this case to Brown, that would be really good for their argument to try to help them win the case. Now, this is going back, we talked about this with Congress. These interest groups are the third part of the iron triangle, okay? So you've got the bureaucracy, we know about that, the bureaucratic agencies, you've got the committees in Congress, but the third part of that triangle is the interest group to help create policies. We also see this with issue networks, where issue networks are similar, where they're trying to influence policy, but it's not as concrete. It's a lot more informal than an iron triangle. They also will try to give money. Another way they try to influence and get their policy goals pushed is to give money to campaigns. So they'll form political action committees, and which have to get approved by the Federal Election Commission. And once they do that, that political action committee for the group, like for instance, for the NRA, their job is to keep track of all the money that they give to different politicians in hopes of getting contact with the politicians once they're in office. They can also form what are known as super PACs. Super PACs are groups that, like, instead of being part of like the NRA, they make their own little like informal group, but it can still promote guns. And you can donate anything to anybody for that. You can donate, like anybody can donate to the super PACs any amount of money. And when they donate to the super PACs, they can make all these advertisements all over the place that could be pro gun. They also try to mobilize the voters with like get out to vote campaigns and endorsements. Another way that they try, another thing that the interest groups can do to get their policy goals implemented is grassroots mobilization. Grassroots lobbying is like working from the bottom and making your way up to the top. So they'll try to pressure local areas and then hope to get national media attention to get up to the top. And they'll do that with spreading their word quickly about the issue, especially through social media. All right. The last thing we're going to talk about are social movements and how they've impacted society. One of the best ways that they had, so that was interest groups and how they work. Now we're going to look at the social movements like we see with like the protests with like Black Lives Matter this summer that we saw. So protest is a demonstration to call attention to a need for change. They can also do this through civil disobedience, where you intentionally break a law that you think is unjust. This has really been, that was something that was really used well in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. So just to give you another quick example of the difference between a social movement and an interest group. So Martin Luther King was kind of the catalyst for the social movement that was the civil rights movement, okay? But he was also in charge of an interest group known as the SCLC, which was a more formal interest group. But their goal was to push this social movement that was the civil rights movement. They can be successful. They can, have failures. It just depends on the impact that it has on the electoral system. Elected officials might accommodate the demands for this. Sometimes they might ignore it. Occupy Wall Street really wasn't very successful because they didn't really have a clear message. But the Me Too social movement had a clear message, and things got done about that, more so than Occupy Wall Street. I mean, here's an example of an Occupy Wall Street activist in New York City. Okay, so you have the right to build a movement. We want to reclaim love and reclaim the heart. Okay, what does that mean? I don't understand. How can policy be created with stuff like that? The right to kindness. Okay, so policy for that, it's hard to understand. The right to redistribute the wealth, that one is a clear-cut message, but the other one's kind of a little confusing. All right, so that's it for chapter what are we on? 15. I forgot it for a second. Basically, what you just need to do is know what interest groups do, know what social movements do, and know the difference between the two. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I'll talk to you later.